Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's nice to have a little break there, and thank you for coming back. I just want to introduce quickly Professor Michael Stein. He's Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disabilities, and he'll be leading off our discussion today. Michael, take it over.
Thank you so much. And you have full bios of our two panelists online if you care to. But just very quickly, Lydia Brown, who's sitting closer to me, is a disability justice advocate, organizer, educator, attorney, strategist, and writer whose work is largely focused on violence against multiply marginalized disabled people, especially institutionalization, incarceration, and policing. And Lydia currently is co-leading the project on disability rights and algorithmic fairness at the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy at Georgetown Law School, among other things. And Dr. Joe Stramondo holds graduate degrees in philosophy and public policy studies. He serves as an assistant professor of philosophy and associate director of the Institute of Ethics and Public Affairs at San Diego State University. And his research focuses on social political power and how they shape the institutional arrangements and practices of bioethics. We just saw an extremely rich film, and our two panelists will focus on them, but some things that we noticed in the film or perhaps noticed were not in the film. One is we noticed the discussion of species-typical functioning, something that is used in bioethics, philosophy, et cetera, to think about whether someone is below the norm. But we often don't, and now we're talking about people who will be above the norm. But notice how the framing in the film is always about things like walking and hearing and seeing, but not about being multilingual or about being able to play several musical instruments. We had some discussions about enhancements and what we would want, and there was very little hard science, which is fine since we'll be focusing on bioethics. But we need to ask ourselves several questions as well. One is, when we talk about using genetic enhancements or other sorts of enhancements, Gregor Volbrink, who, and it's fun to see people I've known for a while, Gregor talks about it's normal to be disabled and to have certain impairments, certain challenges, certain variations. But if we go forward with all these enhancements, if we go forward and take this track, is there a point at which our bodies or our minds actually are exceeding what biologically they were created for? So in the current day of 2020, people are living longer, which is by and large a good thing, but sometimes perhaps we wonder, is it perhaps not such a good thing in that we age into things like Alzheimer's, body decomposing, et cetera. Now, some of it may be responded to by technology and other devices, but some of it may not be. What about enhancements that they discuss in the film? Mostly they talk about running and jumping and thinking and working longer hours. I don't recall anyone speaking about greater empathy or greater social intelligence or greater emotional intelligence. So questions we have for that. Notice some of the differences in the film between those who are congenitally disabled and those who encounter disablement later in lives, and perhaps their perspectives on whether it's cure, whether it's a bad thing to be cured, whether it's a matter of anti-disability pride, or whether it's simply a matter of, well, gosh, who wouldn't want wings to be able to fly around like a fairy? So there are many different framings we can have from this film, and I will have some questions for the panelists afterwards. But Lydia, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. One human enhancement that I would love to have right now is a replacement for the muscles that are spasming in my neck and back. I had an incident that gave me severe whiplash yesterday. So right now, it hurts. Ow. I had written up a couple of reflection questions stemming from this film that I want to address tonight, but before I get into those, another aspect of this conversation that is distinctly absent in this film, and I'd noticed this before, forgotten about it, and upon seeing the film again, remembered that in all of the discussion about enhancements of human intelligence to make somebody smarter, to make someone's mind work faster or focus more or for longer, they speak about the elimination or the drastic reduction in the number of people who might be born with mental disabilities, and Down syndrome, for example, is cited numerous times in the discussion in this film. And yet, while we see clips of performers with Down syndrome a couple of different times from the Sins Invalid performances that are shown, There's never an interview in this entire film with an openly neurodivergent person of any kind. They don't speak to someone speaking from the positionality of being a psychiatric survivor. They don't speak to somebody who has an intellectual or developmental disability. They don't speak to somebody who has profound cognitive or learning disabilities at all. The people who they interview who explicitly or affirmatively identify as or would be considered disabled are all there as people who have different types of physical disabilities. They don't even speak to anyone who is blind or deaf in this entire film. And this omission or this absence is particularly glaring to me. For those of you who don't know me and are not familiar with my work, I come to this place from a positionality of somebody who is openly autistic and multiply neurodivergent. I am in this space as someone who has psychiatric disabilities and cognitive disabilities. And it has always been my experience for a very long time that whenever anyone talks about disability, no matter where they come from, they often treat it in a very reductive and oversimplified way. We speak of one category of disability, those who are born with disabilities, rather than those who acquire them. We speak of one type of disability, those who have a particular type of mobility impairment. And not just all types of mobility impairments, but specific kinds of mobility impairment. And those who can be categorized simply and easily as only having one particular type of disability, rather than the reality that many of us have living as sick, neurodivergent, and disabled people, where we often have many colliding and overlapping forms of illness, neurodivergence, disability. And that omission for me is not just one that smacks of erasure of those who are often at the margins of the margins within disabled communities, but also points to larger and much more profoundly concerning trends in talking about technologies and biotechnologies that seek to enhance people. So when I think about the question of when and how and to what extent is it morally permissible to attempt to make people better, I actually want us to dig deeper, to probe further under that question to ask, to what end are we trying to quote unquote make people better? What are the value judgments that are embedded into beliefs about which kinds of body minds ought not only to exist in the world, but ought to be produced, to be reproduced, and to reproduce themselves? The questions of which kinds of body-minded capacities do we consider to be of a morally positive judgment, and to which do we ascribe a necessarily and automatically negative or detracting judgment? For example, the question often of what is it better to develop? An exoskeleton that helps some people with physical disabilities have the appearance of walking because of a value judgment that to walk is superior than to move in a method that is not ambulatory on two legs? Or is it, as Patty Byrne points out, and I think someone else in this film points out, to be able to have power chairs that have a control panel that is actually waterproof, rather than simply thinking, what can we do to make disabled people more closely approximate the body-minded capacities and functions of those who are categorized as abled? The further questions that I always want us to problematize are those of why we wish to change what human body minds ought to be capable of. When we speak of enhancing mental capacities, we are reinforcing the very profoundly ableist notion that to be intelligent or to think is in fact a defining characteristic of what it means to be human. One of the interviewees in this film, in fact, specifically speaks of having everything non-functional in his body except for what is between his ears, that is the implication, his brain or his mental capacity. For me as a multiply neurodivergent person, I've often encountered people who primarily come to disabled identity through having a physical disability, who do not have any mental disability at all, who will say things like, yes, I have this physical disability, but everything's working upstairs, my mind is fine, or some other variation on that statement. But the value judgment that is embedded into that statement is an assertion of that person's humanity, worth, or value at the direct expense of defining neurodivergent and other mentally disabled people as necessarily less than human, as inferior, or somehow as lacking in the same qualities that define that first person as counting as human, as worthy of dignity, rights, or some semblance of justice. When we move into questions about technologies like CRISPR and other potential methods of editing people's genes now or in the future, I also ask us, what are the implications of those technologies for not just potential people who might exist or who might be bleeped out of existence, but also for existing people, both individually and collectively? Some of the interviewees in this film also speak to this question of saying, what does it say to existing disabled people who are alive now when we devalue disabled existence by presuming that nobody would ever choose to have a disabled child if given an opportunity to make that choice, or that they would never think that a disabled existence might be one worth gaining something from? And I know Joe's going to speak about that in detail, so I will not steal that material from him. But the question is the same. Which kinds of people do we think ought to continue to exist? And when we look at the long and ugly history and ongoing legacies of eugenics, which are a whole set of practices that we like to believe no longer exist, but in fact still inform mainstream science, education, the criminal legal system, and so many other aspects and facets of our society, they are inextricably wrapped up with questions of white supremacy, of settler colonialism, of misogyny and patriarchy, and of ableism. They are inseparable. And so for us to have a conversation about what technologies might have to offer us also behooves us to ask ourselves at every turn, whose benefit will this technology be for? And to whose detriment will this technology be for?
Thank you, Lydia.
That was powerful. I kind of wish I had gone first. But I'll do my best as follow-up here. So the sort of fundamental question that I was thinking about when I was invited to come here is the several times in the movie there were disabled people that express a preference for assistive technology rather than curative technology. And so I'm really interested in that idea. First of all, where the distinction is between assistive and curative technology, because I don't think that's totally clear. And so that's sort of one issue. But then also sort of what would motivate someone to prefer assistive over curative technology. And I think there's, just to sort of start off the discussion as far as the distinction between the two, if you're interested in sort of all the detail of my views, I have a paper on this called The Distinction Between Curative and Assistive Technology. But it actually boils down to a Guinness ad. There was a few Super Bowls ago, I don't remember exactly when, there was an ad for the beer Guinness where it opens up on a bunch of friends sort of playing wheelchair basketball. And it sort of is very kind of inspiration porn-ish with, all of this music and everything of these, friends playing wheelchair basketball and how inspiring and so on. And then at the end of the ad, I think there were 6 of them. 5 of them stand up and walk out of the gym, and the other, 6th person stays in the chair, and they all go and have a pint. And so what this has to do with the distinction between AT and CT is that the shock value of that, right? The shock value of the 5 people standing up is sort of driven by the fact that using assistive technology sort of marks you off as a disabled person, right? And so I try to develop an argument for just the idea that the cleanest distinction we can make between assistive and curative technology is exactly this, that assistive technology is sort of embedded in sort of the cultural representation of disability. And sort of by using it, it sort of is an identifying marker of a disabled person because of its social meaning, okay? And so when I started sort of thinking through that lens about why someone would want to prefer assistive rather than curative technology, it occurred to me that there's sort of at least 2 reasons. First, it has to do with their personal identity, right? In that, sometimes people want to sort of change something about who they are as far as their narrative and how they identify, and that's fine and good sometimes. But for the most part, I think most of us want to sort of maintain our identities, right? When you're forced to change your identity, it's something that is very difficult, very troubling. There's sort of a transition cost to it, right? And so this idea of transition cost is commonly explored in some of the bioethics literature, talking about transitioning from being a non-disabled person to becoming a disabled person, right? And sort of how you have to learn how to be disabled in some sense, and how even if disability itself isn't inherently a bad thing, there's this sort of transition cost of becoming disabled that's difficult, right? And so it occurred to me that there is also transition cost in the opposite direction, right? If you are sort of someone who has, as John Hockenberry highlighted, is, you can't erase the past 30 years of being a spinal cord injured person. And, you have this sort of identity and this way of being that's sort of wrapped up in, the disability identity. There's going to be sort of this sort of transition cost in the opposite direction. And so, when an identity is especially sort of marginalized and stigmatized, that identity is arguably more hard-won, right? That it takes a lot of work to develop a positive disability identity, and so threats to it, like curative technology, can sort of feel more personal, right? It can feel as more of a personal attack, as more of a threat, and so the idea is that assistive technology, because it is sort of embedded in sort of the larger cultural representation of disability, supports disability identity and for lack of a better term, enhances someone's disability identity. And so that's why we might see someone like Patty Byrne talking about how she likes her wheelchair, she doesn't have any desire to walk, and so on and so forth. But then it occurred to me, well, that doesn't really tell us much about CRISPR, right? If something like CRISPR is going to be on the horizon that changes someone's disability status in utero, then that doesn't give a good argument for why we want to sort of preserve that aspect of their identity, right? And so for that, I think that it's not about an individual's identity being preserved by assistive technology, but rather that assistive technology culturally preserves and supports disability culture in a way that I think is important. There's this idea that's sometimes floated, especially in deaf culture, but in other corners of the disability movement, of disability gain, right? That there is certain experiences of disability that are not only positive for the individual, but also just for everyone, that it sort of improves society in some ways to have disabled people in it in a very sort of tangible way, not in this sort of touchy-feely kind of like, oh, it's better if there's more diversity, but in really concrete ways that we can explore. I'm looking at the clock back here, I don't want to talk too much, that we can explore more. And so when it comes to something like CRISPR technology, it occurs to me that what's sort of under threat with the CRISPR technology and why someone would want to prefer the development of assistive rather than curative technology, rather than just sort of the personal adoption of it, has to do with this threat to disability culture and disability gain. And so, yeah.
All right, wonderful. So some questions for the panelists, and then we'll open it up to you, for you to have your questions. So one thing in that sweet spot of bioethics and disability studies, let's turn it around. So if we could use CRISPR or other technologies to remove certain conditions that would express themselves at certain times, assuming we have that predictability, which rarely do we have, but in future we may have more of. What if we turn it around the other way? What if we say that certain people have preferences for having children or others or themselves with certain impairments, conditions, variations affirmatively? And the typical case, and it's overblown because one lesbian couple, right, who are deaf, who wanted to have deaf, capital D, children. But what if, in fact, we could pick genetic variations? What if we could pick deafness? What if we could pick autism? We have no idea what the future will hold. How does that change our argument, and how does that change our perspective about the use or non-use of technology, and who gets to make the choices, and who gets or has to pay for those choices?
I'll respond to that first. And for me, when we ask these questions, it's very hard to separate the context from whether we're asking those questions in the world that we live in now, or whether we're asking those questions in the context of a hypothetical future world. Because in the world that we live in today, it is very much the case that if technologies were available to, for example, decide whether to choose that your child is autistic or to choose that your child will definitely not be autistic, the vast majority of people would choose for their child not to be autistic. And little by little, there would be significantly fewer autistic people in the world. The statistics on Down syndrome, for which there is prenatal testing available, but not, of course, yet the ability to edit a gene before a fetus would be born, show that anywhere, depending on what numbers you look at, it's somewhere in the mid to high 90s of the percentage of fetuses that test positive prenatally for Down syndrome will then be aborted. And that includes, of course, both fetuses where the pregnant person would have intended to abort whether or not the fetus was tested positive with Down syndrome. So they were not planning to carry the pregnancy to term at all. But also fetuses where perhaps the person who was pregnant would have intended to carry the pregnancy to term and wanted to parent a child, but chose not to do so simply because the child tested positive for Down syndrome. It's not inconceivable then that were such technology introduced today, the vast majority of pregnant people and potentially their partners would opt to prevent the introduction of a child who would definitely be autistic. But in a future hypothetical world that was not ableist, where we did not attach a value judgment to which types of brains we considered worthy and valuable and desirable versus which types of brains we considered to be defective or deficient in some way, but also B, we actually had a society in which autistic people were capable of thriving from birth through adulthood, through the end of our lives to the grave, where we would actually be able to receive meaningful, individualized supports that make sense for ourselves, that we choose, that we exercise control over, that maintain our autonomy and support our self-determination throughout our lifetimes, then in fact you might see more people choose to have a child that is definitely autistic, or people make a decision regardless, they don't actually care one way or another. Surprise me, maybe the kid's autistic, maybe the kid's not. Or perhaps to choose a child that wouldn't be. But we don't live in that world now. And while I'd like to believe that that world could be possible, and of course it's the world that I'm working toward, one in which ableism no longer exists, that to ask that question now, of would that change things, is no. And the reason why so many disabled activists fight so hard against the legalization and therefore the imposition of a regulatory scheme around things like prenatal testing, gene editing, or physician-assisted suicide is not because for most of us we're attempting to limit other people's autonomy or the range of choices, but because we recognize that in the world we live in now, it is so profoundly ableist that it would be impossible to support people capable of making those decisions in making those decisions in a way that would be least likely to be influenced by the same ableist ideas that lead to widespread violence of all forms against disabled people. And I think that's why we have to be very careful about the context in which we're asking those questions.
Yeah. Just to piggyback a little bit off of what Lydia said, the term that some bioethicists and philosophers have used for this idea that there's no sort of eugenic program in place, right? There's no government-funded sort of push to try to use propaganda and try to use coercion and so on to sort of steer the direction of reproductive choices. But nevertheless, we have sort of eugenic outcome. There's this word that we call backdoor eugenics, right? Where it's a bunch of individual choices that are influenced by cultural and social norms that have the same end result, right? Or sometimes it's called liberal eugenics is the other term.
Like James Hughes.
Like James Hughes, yeah, refers to. And so I think I largely agree with what Lydia is saying, except that I think that's a powerful argument for not developing or legalizing these technologies. but it's not a powerful argument for restricting the use of the technologies once they're already developed and legalized, right? And so I guess I'm, in some ways, more pessimistic than Lydia.
I don't think it's possible to be more pessimistic than me. I will fight you for that title.
Well, I think I'm more pessimistic in at least one respect, and that is I'm not sure that we can stop the development of some of these technologies and the eventual legalization of these technologies. And so I'm actually working on a book project right now called The Ethics of Choosing Disability, where I try to make exactly this argument that, holding constant the idea that these technologies are coming, are there good reasons to at least allow for some situations in which parents deliberately choose to use things like PGD and CRISPR to have a disabled child, whether they're deaf parents or autistic parents or parents with achondroplasia and so on. I'm interested in sort of trying to explore that notion and make sort of a limited defense of this practice as something that is morally and socially acceptable, in a limited way.
Okay, terrific. And let me follow up and push you both to speak very crisply as to the following question, which is, can you ethically or otherwise distinguish between not what is argued by Peter Singer, go have another child, not what is put forward by eugenics, as in, here is a condition, Down syndrome is a perfect example, and go forward and abort. But rather, do you have an ethical perspective on world one in which we can identify certain conditions that are quote unquote disabling, and we can remove them, but the person is still born? It's not the preventing of the individual being born, it's the prevention of an individual being born with certain conditions. And obviously, the whole patina of ableism, value judgments, et cetera, is layered on it thickly. But how do you distinguish between the two, and what are your thoughts about it? Would you prevent someone from being born as blind? And what does that do to their inherent identity?
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start with Joe and come back to
Yeah, I think I'm understanding the question correctly. So I guess that what I would say is that the big moral question there between something like CRISPR, where you're not preventing a birth, but rather you're changing the characteristics of who will be born. Firstly, there's this expressivist argument that I think still sort of can be maintained in the face of that, right? So somebody like Adrienne Ash's work, where she makes the argument that using something like PGD or selective abortion is an expression of we don't want any more like you, right? Basically, and so I think that there still can be some force behind that kind of argument in light of curative technology like CRISPR. But I think for me, the bigger concern isn't necessarily the expressive force of things, but rather what Rosemary Garland Thompson talks about in terms of disability as natural resource that we want to conserve. And so this is sort of what my second point was about when I was talking earlier about disability gain being something that is important to society in general. And so that would be my major concern for something like CRISPR, even though it doesn't necessarily remove certain people from society as individuals directly. It does remove certain human characteristics from society that I think are valuable in certain ways.
To build off of that, and again, I'm trying to keep this crisp, as you asked. I hear what you did there. I agree with your second point in particular, that there might be characteristics that right now under an ableist regime we think of as detracting from a person's humanity, or at best occasionally providing someone with the ableist language of a splinter skill, but still nonetheless being something that ought to be eradicated as a whole. And I find that line of thinking not just ableist in that very vague idea of devaluing disabled people, but pretty horrifying, because it is a judgment about which kinds of people we think should be allowed to exist in the world. And certainly, I don't believe in attempting to restrict people's autonomy from being able to decide things that they want to decide about themselves. But I ask us to consider the implications of what it means to prevent whole types of people from coming into existence. And also, for those of us who already live in the world as disabled people, for those of us that are in that category of having been born with one or more types of disabilities, when we're asked often, what would be like if you didn't have that disability? If someone says to me, what would it be like if you weren't autistic? I have no idea. And I'm not sure I really want to know, other than maybe a 5-minute cute intellectual exercise, because who I am, for better and for worse, positively and negatively, is inextricably tied to the ways in which my body-mind functions, its capacities and its limitations. And so for many people who live in the world as people that were born disabled, regardless of the type of disability, the idea that there was a version of us that might have existed of technically the same person, but not with that disability, is a little bit brain-breaking. Like, that's not me. It actually wouldn't be me. And it's not that that other person shouldn't exist, especially if that person were brought into the world, but it does raise the question of who was lost. Which other person was lost to the world? So for me, it really is a question of thinking not just what does it mean for other existing disabled people, but what would that mean for the person who could have been disabled, who might have existed, and now, if that technology were introduced and used, does not exist at all.
And of course, we don't know enough about the science. For example, we don't know about the connections between certain genes, which may or may not directly, indirectly, tangentially
Right.
connect
This is a
with each
conversation
other.
that presumes,
Right.
were it possible to identify these 3 genes make a child be autistic? And those are the 3 ones, which I feel like if they discovered that, there'd be a lot of other things happening. But if they did, right, were it possible, could you edit those genes out and replace them? And what would happen if you did? And I think that it would be a conversation for me and for whole communities of disabled people and in disabled cultures of grief and of loss, of generations that could have been and would likely be edited out of existence and the ability to ever come into existence.
Joe, last comment?
Oh, I'm not sure that I have much more to add there, other than that Lydia's right, that when you're talking about sort of the expressive force of some of these technologies, we're not talking about specific embryos that are eliminated or not, right? We're talking about specific people, and even if you have the same embryo, you're changing the identity of the people, right? And so in exactly that way, and for those reasons, it's not going to sort of do away with some of these arguments that are advanced by Adrian Ash and others.
Okay, terrific. We're going to roll into the Q&A session, and I think we have microphones. Here we are. We'll ask you to kindly keep your questions short and have a question mark at the end of it.
This is a real problem in academia.
Hi, I'm Kimora Jones. I am a Radcliffe Fellow this year. I really have appreciated this conversation. I have a question mark at the end of something that I want you to reflect on. So the first thing is, this last bit, our value system is such that we act as if disabled people don't bring something to the table. And it makes me think about how all of these isms, how racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, sap the strength of the whole society. If we were to absent those people, what are we losing? For example, maybe people with autism will be the best suited for long space trips into Mars. I mean, like, you know what I'm saying? If that were a good thing to do. So there are many things that we can't even imagine. So I want your response. I'm going to give you a parallel, and I want you to say, how can we communicate how these isms sap the strength of the whole society? And I'm going to tell you that my work is on racism and health. My definition of racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on so-called race that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And then I generalized that definition. I told you what I'm going to do, and I've already given the question, but I generalized the definition
I asked you to keep it short,
to be,
so please.
yes, I'm almost done. Because I want to know, because this is so I'm going to finish it, so instead of responding to being hurried, generalize the definition so that ableism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on ability status that does those three things: unfairly disadvantages, unfairly advantages, and saps the strength of the whole society. The invisible part for all of these things is how these systems of structured inequity sap the strength of the whole society. How can we communicate that effectively? That is, I think, at the crux of all of these things.
I would like to turn that question back on its head a little bit. And one of the ways that I and some of my friends and colleagues, particularly disabled and negatively racialized people, talk about ableism as inherently and inextricably tied to white supremacy is because it is very contingent upon and based in definitions of humans' intelligence and excellence. That is, that one of the ways that ableist oppression operates is by defining people as worthy of existing, of being in society, of being valued, whatever, right, based on whether they are considered to excel, to be intelligent, to contribute in some way to society. And when one of the examples you gave, maybe autistic people will be great for long space trips to Mars. So here's my problem with that. This is still buying into ableist beliefs about the worth of people, whether they are negatively racialized people, or disabled and negatively racialized people, based on whether and to what extent we can contribute something to people. And my response to that is, we should not be valued based on whether or not we contribute, based on whether or not we have any capacity or strength. If somebody is completely incapable of contributing something to their family, to the neighborhood, to the other community in which they live, they are still valuable as a human being. And they are not in some way, well, we should, because we're not terrible, don't kill them or something, but they don't really contribute something. So for me, the question shouldn't be, how are we failing to communicate that ableism or racism sap the strength of the community, but it should be, why are we defining whether people should think of ableism or racism as awful forces that we should fight to end and dismantle based on the fact that some people of color and some disabled people of color may be able to contribute something to other people. Because I don't ever want my worth to be contingent upon whether or not I can produce something.
Thank you, and I did not mean to say that. I think that we all contribute by our existence, so I'm agreeing with you there. Thank you.
Joe, did you want to?
I'd rather just, I think that, Lydia did a great job. And so rather just follow up on another question.
We have the young lady over there on an hour left. Audience is right.
Hello. My question is essentially this. This whole debate of the video and ability versus disability and the worth of it is essentially around the idea of binaries, good or bad, bad or good, yes, no, black or white, able, disabled. It's a whole system of binaries that we live in. So why not, instead of saying yes to biomechanical engineering and improving the disability or AT versus CT, why not just say, why can't we have both and decide whether let the person decide whether they want CT, AT, or whatever it is. Let them decide. Let them choose. The whole debate around pro-choice or life or pro-life is about choice. Why not let people decide every aspect of their lives and let them design it however they want to? The question is, why do we have to have binaries, and why can't we have an inclusive society that embraces all diversities, no matter how much they come into it? So I would like to hear your responses to that, to see if we can have a debate around that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll take that one. So I think that when I was sort of discussing the distinction between assistive and curative, that I did sort of set it up as a binary. So I think that's exactly right. It sort of called me out on that. But I'm not sure that I ever expressed that it's an either or when it comes to policy, right? I was trying to advance the argument that there's this basic assumption that people would want curative rather than assistive technology, and that we structure institutions of biomedicine to try to develop more curative technology. That when it comes to funding priorities for access to new technology, it's always the curative rather than the assistive that are prioritized. And so I guess my argument is not let's do away with curative technology and instead just have force people into using only assistive technology, but rather let's have greater parity so that there is this sort of authentic choice that someone has between assistive and curative technology. And let's make it so that when you're trying to get a new wheelchair and having conversations about medical necessity, those conversations aren't limited to whether or not the wheelchair is going to let you get from the bed to the bathroom, and that we include sort of other opportunities that the wheelchair can help you access when trying to decide on whether or not somebody has access to it, right? And so I guess it is a false dichotomy to say sort of we either develop more of this technology or that technology, and I'm not in favor of only developing better assistive technology. I just want it to be developed in the first place and be funded and so on.
Okay, do we have other questions from the audience? Here we go.
Hello. Hi, Joe. Hi, Lydia.
Hi,
Joe,
Ari.
I'm glad your wheelchair made it through the air travel trip successfully.
Sorry, there's a bright light in my eyes.
Two-part question. Do you perceive an ethical distinction between heritable genetic modification and somatic gene editing? And then connected to that, with regards to heritable genetic modification, most of what we've seen took place outside of the United States, often within the context of medical tourism. What are the prospects, in your opinion, for an effective international regulatory regime to prohibit or effectively regulate heritable genetic modification?
I think we found the most pessimistic one amongst us. Ari trumps both Lydia and Joe in his pessimism.
I don't know if that's accurate.
Do you want to
say? Did you want to respond to that? Okay, so
Ari didn't even say hello to me.
any question about the potential for effectiveness of an international regulatory scheme, my answer is, for example, look at the entire United Nations human rights bodies and the apparatus, I forget the terminology they use to describe it. The international law is functionally a fictional field that exists by uneasy, uncomfortable, and often begrudging agreement that primarily consists of if we don't publicly shame you, maybe you won't publicly shame us, or we agree to publicly shame each other a little bit mutually with some reciprocity, but only to a limited and lukewarm degree. As in the movie that I keep forgetting the title of which movie this is, and half of you are going to know as soon as I say it. It's the parody movie where these guys go to North Korea to try to assassinate Kim Jong-un. What is this movie? Team America, or I think it is. The Interview, yeah, that's it. So there's a line from the beginning of the movie parroting the United Nations where we're going to write a letter to tell you how very angry we are with you. And while that's meant to be a parody and a joke, unfortunately, in reality, international law doesn't have the same force behind it as domestic law at least can when it is in fact enforced. And the reason for that in my view, is because international law would require the actual corporation of all of the nations that were ostensibly agreeing to be bound by it to meaningfully and consistently enforce it and abide by its tenets. And we already see just how frequently nation states fail to do so, whether that's on conditions of imprisonment, whether that is on access to health care, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which the United States, for example, refuses to ratify.
So far be it from me to defend international law, a topic for which I have, rampaging contempt. But we do have semi-effective international regulatory regimes around nuclear weapons. Do you anticipate?
Theory.
In practice, nuclear proliferation has been managed, I think relative to where it could be. Do you anticipate that there is, I'd be curious for both of your thoughts on this, the possibility of the development of a similarly semi-effectual, effective international regulatory regime with regards to heritable genetic modification?
And I'm going to tell you very briefly why. It goes back to our lunch discussion, which I'm sorry that you weren't able to join us. And the answer is, there are semi-effective international regulatory schemes, for example, around the use of smallpox samples or Yersinia pestis samples, that's the plague, for those who do not know. And there are only a handful of laboratories in the world that are allowed to maintain samples of live smallpox or of live plague. And that works, I would say, in large part because most people think, that sounds horrifying and scary. I don't want a global pandemic of plague. But I don't think that most people outside of critical conversations like this one, whether activists or scholars or whoever it is that's in the room, have the same appreciation for the dangers of hereditary gene editing compared to the very clear danger of a smallpox pandemic.
Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and I also think that we have to talk about the dollars and cents of this too, in that there's financial motivation to develop heritable CRISPR technology, and so there's that in the background, that there is if you were able to do it in a way that is perceived as safe, you're going to make a whole lot of money.
And that actually brings us back to one of the themes in the film, which is the place, role, and danger of elitism as far as accessing certain technologies, whether it's on a more seemingly benign level, such as you and I having very expensive mobility assistance, or if it's in a under-the-radar level of persons living in the Gulf where abortion is absolutely illegal but have the resources, as they always have, to go to Switzerland, England, France, etc., or whether it's medical tourism. Isn't it the case that at some level, once the technology exists, some people will be able to access it, right?
Yeah, so it's not only sort of where the technology is being developed, but also, the idea that people can move around and get on an airplane and access it in different places. Yeah, no, I think that's right.
And then what do? Do you have a penalty for using too much Botox,
Yeah.
being too tall, being too blonde? Could be. All right, so wonderful questions, wonderful things for us to think about. We're right at the end of our time together. Thank you all so much for joining us on a Monday evening. Please join me in thanking the panelists and Radcliffe.